Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into a world without Wi-Fi, without coffee shops and without malls. We're going medieval. Forget the romantic tales of knights and castles you've seen in movies. We're talking about the real Middle Ages, the time of mud, disease, and a daily struggle just to survive. So before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, grab a blanket, and let the fire crackle in the background. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through history, consider subscribing. But only if it feels right. And if you'd like, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always find it fascinating to see who's joining me on these late-night journeys. Now, let's drift back. Back to the year 1325. You're about to wake up in medieval Europe. And trust me, you're not going to like it. Congratulations. You've just woken up in medieval times. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. Your bed is a half-rotted straw mattress, stuffed with bugs and hay that smells like a barn floor, because it was a barn floor 3 months ago. There's no memory foam, no pillows, and definitely no Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last winter and now weighs roughly as much as a small cow from the accumulated grime. You blink awake as the church bell clangs in the distance. It's the medieval version of an alarm clock, only louder and somehow even less merciful. Your home is a wooden hut with one room, no windows, and a charming open-concept floor plan where your family, livestock, and domestic insects all share the same space. The smell. Oh, the smell. It's a fragrant symphony. A subtle blend of stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something you pray it's not mold, but you know it probably is. Scented candles haven't been invented. And even if they were, they'd just melt on your dirt floor. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it, because the air is freezing and your joints ache. You're 22 years old, which in medieval terms is roughly middle-aged. Your spine cracks like an old wooden door, and your knees sound like a bag of rocks being shaken by a confused peasant. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is either wet from last night's rain, which leaks through the thatched roof, or crusty from something your neighbor's chicken did. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the ecosystem. Oh, and privacy. What's that? Your entire family, and maybe a random cousin who just never left, are waking up beside you. There's no bedroom, no curtains, no me time. Just communal everything. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you're never truly alone because parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always with you. And this is just how your day starts. It only gets worse from here. So you've managed to crawl out of your medieval haystack of horrors. Congrats. Now nature calls. And it's not calling politely. It's screaming. Here's the part where you start missing the modern bathroom. Because in medieval times, there is no bathroom. There's just a hole. Maybe. If you're lucky. Most peasants don't even have that luxury. You stumble outside into the cold morning air, which would be refreshing if it didn't smell like 1,000 years of poor waste management decisions. Your toilet. It's called the great outdoors. Or if you're fancy, a communal pit shared by your entire village. Picture this, a wooden plank with a hole cut into it, positioned over a trench that hasn't been emptied since your grandfather was a boy. The smell alone could strip paint off a castle wall. There's no toilet paper. Not even close. You've got a few options, a handful of straw, some moss you found near the river, or if you're really desperate, your hand. And no, there's no soap waiting for you afterward. Soap is for rich people and monks. You get a quick rinse in a bucket of cold, possibly contaminated water. Maybe. Let's talk about what happens if you get sick. Upset stomach. Dysentery. Worms. What a shame. No doctor, no pharmacy, no antacid. You just have to suffer and hope you don't die. Warning, many people died brutally. In fact, using the toilet in the Middle Ages was actually dangerous. People fell into cesspools and drowned. Others contracted diseases from the dirty water. Some even got their butts bitten by rats while crouching in the dark. It's not just uncomfortable, it's a real struggle. If you think things are bad outside, wait for winter. Imagine walking through the snow in the middle of the night, half asleep, barefoot, just to squat over a frozen hole. When you're done, you have to protect your feet from the snow, your dignity from the wind. But oh well, at least you're alive. For now. You've survived the morning ordeal. Your feet are wet, your hands are doubtful, and your soul is damaged. Now it's time for the most important part of the day. Breakfast. But not eggs and toast. Not even oatmeal. Soup. Soup again. Soup, a thick, grayish soup made from what didn't rot last season. Barley, peas, onions if you're lucky, and water. Lots of water. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, maybe even weeks, because no one has time to clean pots when they're busy trying not to die. Sometimes there's bread, too. But it's not the fluffy, handmade sourdough bread you're dreaming of. Medieval bread is dense, lumpy, and occasionally contains bits of grist from the mill. Chewing is a pain in the neck for your teeth. If they're still intact, they won't thank you. Oh, and if the harvest is bad, that bread can be mixed with sawdust, acorns, or other creative ingredients, because wheat is a rich man's fantasy. This loaf is not your friend. You don't slice it. You bargain with it. What about drinks? You can't have oranges, Coke, or, unfortunately, lattes. You drink beer. Yes, beer. At 6 in the morning. Why? Because water is full of parasites and dirt. So you start your day with light beer, low in alcohol, and high in survival. Children drink too. No one's happy about it, but at least it won't kill you right away. Do you want meat? Or cheese? Imagine. Those are for Sundays and saints' feasts, and only when your Lord is feeling generous. Most peasants don't eat meat more than a few times a year. As for fresh fruit, only in season, when it hasn't yet fermented into wine. Don't even think about spices. Unless you're royalty, a pinch of black pepper costs more than your monthly salary. Salt is precious enough to be locked away. So you chew your crusty bread, sip your medieval beer, and try not to think about the mouse that gnawed at your porridge at night. Breakfast doesn't give you energy. It just happens. And now that you've had enough, it's time to get to work. As if your life depended on it. Because it certainly does. You've eaten your dreary medieval breakfast, and now it's time to get dressed. Not that that would help. Your wardrobe consists of exactly one item of clothing. What is it? A coarse wool tunic or linen shirt that you've worn every day for months, maybe even years. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion. You wear it until it falls apart or gives you a yeast infection. Underwear? Optional. If you're lucky, maybe a linen undershirt. If not, you'll probably be running around like a commando under layers of itchy, sweaty wool, meticulously stitched by someone who has no idea what a seam should look like. There's no washing machine, no soap, and certainly no dry cleaners. So your clothes are stained, stiff, and smell like a compost heap left to marinate in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to wash them, it's not easy. You'd have to fetch water from a river or a well, heat it over a fire, rub your tunic on a board with ashes or lye, and hang it in the sun for about 3 days a year. And don't let me start on shoes. If you own any, they're made of untreated leather, barely stitched together, and offer as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants just go barefoot. Through mud, through dung, through medieval landmines, also known as sharp rocks and disease puddles. All this means one thing. Your skin hates you. You itch. Constantly. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs live rent-free on your body. Everyone has them. Nobles, lousy. Monks, itchy. children. Walking insect farms. No one escapes. You'll be scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the local priest, and no one will even blink. This is part of your life. You also probably have some kind of rash. Maybe it's from the wool. Maybe it's from the parasites. Maybe it's scabies. Who knows? Certainly not you, because dermatology won't be invented for another 600 years. And if you get a cut, even a small one, that's potentially a death sentence. There's no antiseptic, no bandages, just a dirty rag and a prayer. Infections spread fast, and once gangrene sets in, well, your options are amputation by the village barber, or death. Sometimes both. The barber, by the way, is also your surgeon, your dentist, and occasionally your executioner. He's a busy man. Oh, and let's talk about dental hygiene. There isn't any. You've got maybe half your teeth left if you're over 30. The other half rotted out or got knocked loose by that rock-hard bread. Toothbrushes. Toothpaste. Floss. Not a chance. If you're wealthy, you might chew on a twig. If you're a peasant, you just live with the pain and the smell. Your breath could kill a horse. Literally. Horses have died from less. People don't bathe often. Not because they don't want to, but because it's hard. You'd need to heat gallons of water over a fire, find a tub, and then sit in your own filth soup while hoping no one steals your clothes. And by the way, some people don't even have a tub. Public bathhouses exist in some towns, but they're expensive, crowded, and not exactly sanitary. You're basically marinating in communal grime. So most people just don't. They wipe down with a damp cloth every few weeks and call it good. The result? Everyone smells. All the time. You, your neighbors, the priest, the lord in his fancy castle. Different degrees of awful, but all awful nonetheless. And here's the kicker. You don't even realize how bad it is because everyone smells the same. There's no frame of reference. You're all just stewing in medieval funk together, wondering why God allows so much suffering. Spoiler, it's the lack of soap. Now that you're dressed, scratching, and vaguely aware of your own mortality, it's time to work. And by work, I mean backbreaking, soul-crushing, 12-hour-a-day labor in the fields. Because you're a peasant. And peasants don't get weekends. Your job. Farming. Not the romantic, pastoral kind with a picturesque red barn and a friendly cow named Bessie. No, this is medieval subsistence farming, where you're one bad harvest away from starvation. You work the land that belongs to your lord. Not you. Him. And in exchange for the privilege of not starving immediately, you give him a huge chunk of whatever you grow. It's called feudalism, and it's a fantastic deal. For him. You wake up before dawn and head to the fields with a wooden plow that's older than your grandfather and about as effective as a spoon. If you're lucky, you have an ox to help. If you're not, you're the ox. You'll spend hours turning soil, planting seeds, pulling weeds, and praying the weather cooperates. Too much rain. Your crops rot. Not enough rain. They shrivel and die. Perfect weather. Great, but now you've got locusts. Or blight. Or your neighbor's goat eating everything. There's always something. And it's not just crops. You've got animals to tend. Chickens that refuse to lay eggs. Pigs that escape constantly. A cow that might be sick, but you can't afford a veterinarian because that's not a thing yet. So you just hope she pulls through, because if she dies, your family's milk supply dies with her. Harvest season is the worst. Everyone in the village works from sunrise to sunset, cutting grain with sickles, bundling sheaves, and hauling everything back before it rains. Your back screams. Your hands bleed. Your feet are torn up from walking through stubble. And after all that work, after you've nearly killed yourself bringing in the harvest, your lord's men show up and take most of it. Because taxes. Because tithes. Because that's just how it works. You're left with barely enough to survive the winter. And if the harvest was bad, well, you're not surviving the winter. You're rationing moldy grain and hoping spring comes early. Spoiler, it doesn't. But let's say you survive. Congratulations. Tomorrow, you get to do it all over again. And the day after that. And the day after that. There are no vacation days. No sick leave. No retirement plan. You work until your body gives out, and then you die. Hopefully quickly. And it's not just field work. You've also got duties to your lord. Maybe he needs a new road built. Or a bridge repaired. Or a wall constructed around his estate. Guess who's doing that for free? You. It's called corvée labor, and it's mandatory. You don't get paid. You don't even get a thank you. You just show up, work until you collapse, and then go back to your regular job of not starving. Oh, and if there's a war. And there's always a war. Your lord might conscript you to fight. You, a farmer with zero combat training, will be handed a rusty spear and told to march toward people who actually know how to kill. Your chances of survival? Not great. Your chances of getting paid? 0. But hey, if you're lucky, you might get to loot a corpse. That's something. Let's say you make it through the day. The sun is finally setting. You're exhausted, filthy, and mildly injured from something that will probably get infected. Now it's time for dinner. And dinner is, you guessed it, pottage. Again. The same gray slop you had for breakfast, except now it's been sitting out all day, collecting flies and developing a questionable film on top. You scrape it into a wooden bowl, the same bowl your family shares because individual dishes are a luxury, and you eat. There's no table. You sit on the dirt floor or maybe a bench if your family is fancy. The spoon is wooden and splintered. Every bite is an adventure in texture and regret. Sometimes there's bread to go with it. The same rock-hard, tooth-breaking bread from this morning. If you're really lucky, someone caught a fish. But it's been sitting in the sun for 6 hours, so now it smells like betrayal and tastes worse. And drink? More ale. Weak, slightly sour ale that tastes like it was brewed in a boot. Which it might have been. You drink it anyway, because the alternative is water, and water is essentially a suicide note. At least the ale kills some of the bacteria. Probably. Meals are eaten in silence, mostly because everyone's too tired to talk. Your father stares into the fire. Your mother patches a hole in someone's tunic for the 8th time this month. Your siblings are already asleep in a pile near the hearth, because there's nothing else to do. There's no entertainment. No books, because you can't read. No music, unless someone in the village owns a lute and feels like playing. No games, no stories, no distractions from the crushing monotony of existence. You just sit there, chewing your bread, sipping your ale, and contemplating the fact that tomorrow will be exactly the same as today. And the day after that. And every day until you die. After dinner, if you can call it that, it's time for bed. And by bed, I mean that same flea-infested straw mattress you woke up on this morning. You're still wearing your clothes, because you only have one set and it's freezing. You lie down next to your entire family, the goat, and a chicken that wandered in. There's no privacy. No personal space. Just a shared pile of body heat and poor life choices. The fire is dying, because wood is expensive and you've already burned through most of your supply. The temperature drops. You pull that scratchy wool blanket up to your chin and try to ignore the itching. The fleas are back. They never really left. You close your eyes and try to sleep, but it's hard. Your back hurts. Your stomach is growling because dinner was 3 bites of slop. Something is crawling on your leg. You're not sure what it is, and honestly, you don't want to know. Outside, you can hear the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. It's pitch black. No streetlights, no porch lights, not even a candle burning in the neighbor's window because candles are expensive and nobody wastes them after dark. The only light comes from the faint glow of embers in the hearth, and even that's fading fast. You stare up at the thatched ceiling and wonder if this is what the rest of your life will look like. Spoiler, it is. There's no upward mobility. No career ladder to climb. No dreams of retiring early and moving to the countryside, because you're already in the countryside and you'll never retire. You're a peasant. You were born a peasant. Your children will be peasants. Your grandchildren, assuming any of you survive that long, will also be peasants. This is it. This is the life. And if you're thinking, well, at least I have my health, let me stop you right there. You don't. Nobody in medieval Europe has their health. You've got parasites, malnutrition, joint pain, and probably some kind of respiratory issue from spending your entire life breathing smoke in poorly ventilated huts. Your teeth are rotting. Your vision is going. And that cough you've had for 3 months. Yeah, that's not going away. That's just part of you now. Let's talk about disease for a moment, because it's everywhere. The Black Death might be the most famous medieval killer, but it's far from the only one. There's typhus, dysentery, smallpox, tuberculosis, and about a dozen other illnesses that don't even have names yet. And when you get sick, there's no doctor. Well, there might be a doctor, but he's in the next town over and charges more than you'll earn in a year. So instead, you go to the village wise woman, who'll give you a poultice made of herbs, animal fat, and hope. Will it work? Probably not. But it's cheaper than the doctor, and honestly, his treatments aren't much better. Medieval medicine is essentially a coin flip between, this might help, and, this will definitely make it worse. Oh, and if you're a woman, congratulations. Your life is somehow even harder. You're doing all the same labor as the men, plus you're expected to cook, clean, raise children, spin wool, make clothes, and basically hold the entire household together. And if you get pregnant, which you probably will multiple times, your chances of dying in childbirth are terrifyingly high. There's no prenatal care, no epidurals, no sterile hospital rooms. Just you, a midwife who may or may not know what she's doing, and a whole lot of prayer. If you survive childbirth, great. Now you get to watch half your children die before they reach age 5. Infant mortality is staggering. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, it all adds up. It's uncommon for a woman to give birth to 8 or 9 children and only see 2 or 3 make it to adulthood. And there's nothing you can do about it. No medicine, no intervention, just acceptance and grief. But let's say you beat the odds. You survive childhood, avoid the plague, make it through a few harsh winters, and somehow live to the ripe old age of 40. Congratulations. You're ancient. Your back is ruined, your hands are gnarled, and you look about 70 by modern standards. But you're still expected to work. There's no retirement, remember. You'll keep dragging yourself to the fields until your body literally gives out. And when it does, when you finally collapse and can't get back up, that's it. You'll die in that same hut you were born in, surrounded by the same poverty you've known your entire life. And here's the worst part. Nobody will remember you. There's no obituary, no headstone with your name carved into it. You'll be buried in an unmarked grave in the village churchyard, and within a generation or two, even your own descendants will forget you existed. You weren't a king, a knight, or a scholar. You were just another peasant. One of millions who lived, suffered, and died in obscurity. So yeah. You wouldn't last a day in medieval times. Not because you're weak, but because medieval life was designed to break people. It was ruthless, unforgiving, and brutally unfair. Every single day was a fight for survival, and most people lost. But before we leave the daily grind of medieval peasant life behind, let's talk about something that made everything infinitely worse. Winter. The great equalizer. The season that didn't care if you were prepared or not. It came every year, and every year, it took people with it. Imagine it's deep January. The kind of cold that isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. You wake up and your breath hangs in the air like a ghost. The fire you tried so hard to keep going through the night has died. Again. And now you're facing a choice: use the last of your firewood now, or save it for tonight and hope you can find more during the day. The walls of your hut are doing almost nothing. Wind screams through every crack, every gap in the wood. Frost has formed on the inside of the walls. Yes, inside. Your blanket, that scratchy wool thing you've been sharing with 5 other people, is stiff with ice where your breath condensed and froze overnight. You're wearing every piece of clothing you own. Which is still just one wool tunic, maybe 2 if you're lucky. And you're sharing body heat with your entire family, plus a goat and a couple of chickens that wandered inside. The goat is probably warmer than you are. Outside, the world has vanished. Everything is white. The fields are buried under snow. The paths you've walked your entire life are invisible. The forest where you'd normally gather wood is a wall of white and gray, and going in there means risking getting lost and freezing to death within sight of your own home. But you have to go out. The animals still need tending. The wood still needs gathering. Life doesn't stop just because you're cold. So you wrap whatever rags you can find around your hands, pull your hood up, and step into the bite. The wind hits you like a slap. Snow stings your face. Your eyes water immediately, and the tears freeze on your cheeks. You can barely see 3 feet ahead, but you know the way by memory. You've walked this path every single day of your life. You could do it blind. And today, you basically are. When you finally reach the small shelter where your cow and chickens huddle, you check on them with numb fingers. The cow is shivering, its breath coming out in thick clouds. 2 of the chickens are dead. Frozen solid. You'll eat them tonight if they haven't started to rot. Waste nothing. That's the rule. That's always been the rule. Back inside, you try to warm up, but warmth is a distant memory. You crouch by the hearth and blow on the embers, coaxing them back to life with the last few sticks of kindling you have. You know that tomorrow, you'll need to venture into the forest for more. Assuming the storm breaks. Assuming you have the strength. Your father sits in the corner, coughing. That same wet, rattling cough he's had for weeks. Everyone hears it. No one mentions it. Because talking about it won't change anything. There's no medicine. No doctor. Just time, and hope, and the knowledge that winter takes the week. The food situation is getting desperate. That bag of grain you've been carefully rationing since October. Almost empty. The dried peas. Gone last week. The salted pork you were saving. Your family of 6 finished it a month ago. Now you're eating less every day. Your stomach stopped growling because it's given up. Your children have stopped asking for more because they've learned that asking doesn't make food appear. So you sit. And you wait. You wait for the storm to pass. You wait for the snow to melt. You wait for spring, which feels like a myth right now, a story people tell to keep hope alive. But hope is expensive in winter. And you're running low on everything. Night falls early. By mid-afternoon, the light is already fading, and somehow the cold gets worse. It seeps through everything. Through the walls, through your clothes, through your skin, into your bones. You gather with your family around the weak fire, and someone suggests a prayer. So you pray. Not because you really believe it'll help, but because it's something to do. Something to make you feel a little less powerless. And then it's time for bed. Same straw mattress. Same frozen blanket. Same pile of bodies pressed together, trying to share what little warmth you have left. You close your eyes and listen to the wind howl outside. It sounds angry. Hungry. This is winter in medieval Europe. And this is how people lived. How they survived. Not because they were tougher than us, but because they had no other choice. They endured because the alternative was dying, and some stubborn part of the human spirit refuses to give in that easily. But we're not done yet. Because surviving one day in medieval times, brutal as it was, is only part of the story. There's something else we need to talk about. Something that governed every aspect of medieval life, from the moment you were born to the moment you died. Let me tell you about the one thing that shaped everything. The ultimate power in the Middle Ages. The force that was more powerful than any king, any army, any plague. The Church. The church wasn't just a building you visited on Sundays. It was everything. It controlled what you believed, how you lived, when you worked, what you ate, who you married, and how you died. There was no separation of church and state because the church was the state. Or at least, it acted like it. From the moment you were born, the church had you. Baptism wasn't optional. If you died unbaptized, even as an infant, you weren't going to heaven. You were going to limbo, or worse, hell. So within days of birth, sometimes hours, you were taken to the church and dunked in holy water while a priest muttered Latin words you'd never understand. And that was just the beginning. Every major event in your life was marked by the church. Marriage? That's a sacrament. Having children? Better get them baptized. Dying? You'll need last rites, or your soul is damned. The church had a monopoly on salvation, and they made sure you never forgot it. Sunday Mass was mandatory. Not strongly suggested. Mandatory. If you didn't show up, the whole village would know, and you'd face social consequences, possibly even punishment from the local lord. So every Sunday, no matter how tired you were, no matter how much work was waiting in the fields, you dragged yourself to church. The service was entirely in Latin. A language you didn't speak. A language nobody in your village spoke except the priest, and even he probably wasn't fluent. You stood there for hours, sometimes 2 or 3, listening to words you couldn't understand, watching rituals you'd been told were sacred but had no real grasp of. You weren't supposed to understand. You were supposed to obey. The church building itself was the most impressive structure you'd ever seen. Stone walls, high ceilings, stained glass windows that cast colored light across the floor. It was designed to make you feel small. Insignificant. To remind you that God was infinite and you were dust. And it worked. You'd spend your whole life in a wooden hut with a dirt floor, and then you'd step into this massive stone cathedral and feel the weight of eternity pressing down on you. The priest was the most powerful person in your village. More powerful than the Lord, in some ways, because the Lord might control your body, but the priest controlled your soul. He decided if you were living a moral life. He heard your confessions, knew your sins, and had the power to deny you communion, which was basically a death sentence for your eternal soul. Confession was required at least once a year, usually before Easter. You'd kneel in front of the priest and confess every sin you'd committed. Lying, stealing, lustful thoughts, anger, envy, everything. And the priest would assign penance. Say 10 Hail Marys. Fast for 3 days. Donate to the church, which you couldn't afford but would do anyway because the alternative was damnation. And then there were the saints. Oh, the saints. There was a saint for everything. Sick cow. Pray to Saint Blaise. Lost something. Saint Anthony. Toothache. Saint Apollonia. The church had turned spirituality into a bureaucracy, and you had to know which saint handled which department. Relics were everywhere. A splinter of the true cross. A vial of saint's blood. A bone from some martyr nobody had heard of. These relics were treated like magical objects. People believed they could heal the sick, protect crops, ward off evil. Churches collected them like trophies, and pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles just to stand near a box that supposedly contained a saint's fingernail. You were told that suffering was good. That poverty brought you closer to God. That the meek would inherit the earth, which was convenient for the people in charge because it meant you wouldn't complain about being poor and oppressed. Just accept it. Suffer quietly. Your reward is in heaven, not here. And heaven. Let's talk about heaven. You were told it was a place of eternal peace and joy, where there was no pain, no hunger, no cold. Streets of gold, angels singing, the presence of God. It sounded incredible, especially when your daily life was mud, hunger, and frostbite. Heaven was the ultimate prize, and all you had to do was obey the church, avoid sin, and endure whatever horrors life threw at you. But then there was hell. And the church made sure you knew exactly what hell was like. Fire. Eternal fire. Demons tearing at your flesh. Torment that never ended, not for 1,000 years, not for 1,000,000, but forever. And the worst part? You could end up there for relatively minor sins. Miss Mass too many times. Hell. Die with unconfessed sins. Hell. Eat meat on Friday. Believe it or not, hell. The church used fear like a weapon. They controlled the population not with armies, but with the threat of eternal damnation. And it worked. People were terrified. Genuinely, deeply terrified of what would happen to their souls after death. Tithes were required. 10% of everything you produced went to the church. Grain, livestock, vegetables, whatever you had, the church got a cut. And this wasn't negotiable. The church needed money to build cathedrals, pay priests, fund monasteries, and live in comfort while you starved. But you paid. Because not paying meant excommunication, and excommunication meant hell. So you gave. You gave your time, your money, your obedience. You bent your life around the church's rules. You fasted during Lent, even though you were already half-starved. You attended every Mass, every feast day, every holy day of obligation. You prayed before meals, before bed, when you woke up. Prayer was woven into every part of your existence. And yet, despite all of this, despite the fear and the control and the suffering, the church also provided something important. Community. Structure. A sense of meaning in a world that was chaotic and brutal. It told you that your suffering mattered, that you mattered, even if you were just a peasant. It promised that there was more to life than mud and hunger. That this wasn't the end. Whether you believed it or not didn't really matter. You didn't have a choice. But the church didn't just control your spiritual life. It controlled your calendar. Your entire year was organized around religious festivals and holy days. And there were a lot of them. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, All Saints' Day, the feast days of dozens of local saints. Some estimates suggest there were over 50 holy days scattered throughout the year where you were expected to stop working and attend church. Which sounds nice, like having extra days off. Except you didn't get paid. There was no such thing as paid time off. So every holy day meant less work, which meant less food, which meant more hunger. But you observed them anyway, because not observing them was a sin. Lent was particularly brutal. 40 days of fasting before Easter. No meat, no eggs, no dairy, no fun. Just bread, vegetables if you had them, and fish if you lived near water. For 40 days, you made your already miserable diet even worse because the church said suffering brought you closer to God. Your stomach disagreed, but your stomach wasn't in charge. Then there were the pilgrimages. If you were devout, or desperate, or trying to atone for some serious sin, you might go on a pilgrimage. Travel to a distant shrine, maybe Canterbury, maybe Rome if you were really ambitious. Walk for weeks or months, sleeping in the open, begging for food, risking bandits and disease, all to stand in front of some holy relic and pray. Why? Because the church taught that pilgrimages earned you spiritual merit. They reduced your time in purgatory, that waiting room between death and heaven where souls were purged of sin through suffering. The more you suffered on earth, the less you'd suffer after death. So people walked until their feet bled, starved themselves, endured unimaginable hardship, all for the promise of a slightly shorter stay in purgatory. Monasteries and convents dotted the landscape. Some people, usually younger sons with no inheritance or women with no marriage prospects, entered religious life. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They spent their days praying, copying manuscripts, brewing beer, making cheese, and generally living apart from the world. It sounds peaceful, maybe even appealing compared to peasant life. And in some ways, it was. Monasteries had stone buildings, regular meals, and education. Monks could read and write, which was more than most nobles could say. But it also meant giving up everything. Your freedom, your family, your chance at a normal life. You belonged to God now, and God, through the church, owned you completely. Excommunication was the ultimate punishment. If you seriously defied the church, if you committed heresy or refused to pay tithes or openly challenged a priest, you could be excommunicated. Cut off from the church entirely. No mass, no sacraments, no communion, no confession, no last rites. You were spiritually dead. And it got worse. Other Christians were forbidden from associating with you. Your family might abandon you. Your neighbors would shun you. You couldn't do business, couldn't marry, couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. You were an outcast in this life and damned in the next. Excommunication was social and spiritual death, and the church wielded it like a sword. Heresy was even more dangerous. If you questioned church doctrine, if you said the wrong thing to the wrong person, you could be accused of heresy. And heretics burned. The church didn't technically kill people, that would be unchristian, so they handed heretics over to secular authorities who did the burning for them. It was a technicality, and everyone knew it. The Inquisition would come later, but even in the early Middle Ages, people understood that thinking too independently was dangerous. So you kept your doubts to yourself. You nodded along. You repeated the prayers. You played the part, because the alternative was fire. Despite all the control, all the fear, the church also provided stability. In a world without governments, police, or social services, the church filled the gaps. It ran hospitals, or what passed for hospitals. It provided charity to the desperately poor, though never enough. It preserved knowledge through monasteries that copied ancient texts. The church told you that your life had meaning, even if that life was short and painful. It gave you rituals to mark births, marriages, and deaths. It promised that suffering wasn't meaningless, that there was a reason for everything, even if you couldn't see it. And in a world as brutal as medieval Europe, that promise was everything. Whether the church was right or wrong, whether its grip on society was just or tyrannical, didn't really matter. It was the only game in town. You were born into it, lived under it, and died within it. There was no escape. No alternative. Just obedience, faith, and the hope that when you finally died, all that suffering would mean something. But let's move on. Because as oppressive as the church was, there was something even more terrifying lurking in medieval life. Something that could wipe out entire villages in days. Something that turned your body against you and left you begging for death. Let's talk about disease. Nobody knew what caused the plague. They blamed everything. Bad air, called miasma. The alignment of planets. God's punishment for sin. Jews were scapegoated and murdered in pogroms across Europe. None of it stopped the plague because none of it was the real cause. The real cause was fleas on rats, carrying bacteria called Yersinia pestis. But they wouldn't figure that out for another 500 years. The plague came in waves. It would arrive, devastate a region, and then disappear for years. Then it would come back. This happened over and over for centuries. Every few decades, another outbreak. More death. More panic. More prayers that went unanswered. Living through the plague was psychological torture. You'd wake up fine and be dead by nightfall. Your neighbor would be healthy one day and covered in buboes the next. You never knew who would be next. Some people tried to flee. Others locked themselves in their homes. Nothing really worked. The plague went wherever it wanted. So you lived with constant fear. Fear of getting sick. Fear of your children dying. Fear that any cough, any fever, any unusual feeling might be the start of something fatal. And often, it was. But you survived. Not because you were lucky or strong, though that helped. You survived because millions of others didn't. The disease burned through the population, taking the vulnerable, and leaving the survivors to rebuild. That was life in medieval Europe. Not everyone made it. But some did. And that was enough to keep going. But let's shift away from death and disease for a moment. There's something else about medieval life that was surprisingly strange. Something so different from how we live today that it sounds almost impossible. Let's talk about how medieval people slept. You might think sleep is sleep. You close your eyes, you wake up 8 hours later, done. But in medieval Europe, that's not how it worked. People didn't sleep through the night. They split it in two. This was called segmented sleep, and it was completely normal. Here's how it went. Shortly after sunset, once the light was gone and there was nothing left to do, people would go to bed. This was first sleep. They'd sleep for about 4 hours, maybe until midnight or 1 in the morning. Then they'd wake up. Deliberately. This wasn't insomnia. This was planned. The period between first sleep and second sleep was called the watch, or sometimes the watching period. And people used this time for all sorts of things. Some would pray. Religious texts from the period specifically recommend this time for prayer and reflection. The house was quiet, distractions were minimal, and your mind was supposedly more open to spiritual thoughts. Others would tend to practical matters. Check the fire to make sure it hadn't gone out. Add more wood. Check on the animals to make sure they were still alive and hadn't been stolen or eaten by wolves. In winter, you'd want to make sure the barn door was still latched and snow hadn't blown in. Some people used this time for more intimate activities. Historical records and medical texts from the period suggest that the watch was considered an ideal time for relations between husband and wife. One medieval doctor even wrote that children conceived during this period were thought to be healthier and more intelligent. Whether that was true is questionable, but people believed it. Other folks would visit neighbors. Yes, in the middle of the night. If you woke up during the watch and felt like chatting, you might walk over to a neighbor's house and have a conversation. This wasn't seen as weird or rude. It was normal. Everyone was awake anyway. Some would light a candle and do small tasks. Mending clothes, carving wood, preparing food for the next day. Nothing too strenuous, but useful work that took advantage of the quiet time. The watch period typically lasted 1 to 2 hours. Then, when you felt tired again, you'd go back to bed for second sleep. This would last until dawn, when the rooster crowed or the church bell rang for morning prayers. This pattern wasn't unique to peasants. Everyone did it. Nobles, monks, merchants. It was simply how humans slept before artificial lighting changed everything. And it lasted for centuries. References to first sleep and second sleep appear in literature, legal documents, and medical texts throughout the medieval period and even into the early modern era. It was only after the Industrial Revolution, when gas lighting and then electric lighting became common, that people started sleeping in one continuous block. Suddenly you could stay up late working, reading, socializing. The natural rhythm of sleep shifted, and segmented sleep gradually disappeared. By the 20th century, almost no one in the Western world did it anymore. But sleep itself in medieval times was uncomfortable even without the segmented pattern. Remember that straw mattress we talked about earlier? That's what most people slept on. It would flatten over time, becoming lumpy and uneven. It would rot if it got wet. And it was full of bugs. Fleas, lice, mites, all burrowing into the straw and then into you while you slept. Pillows were rare. If you had one, it was probably a sack stuffed with straw or feathers. But most people just used a rolled-up piece of clothing or nothing at all. Your head rested on the same surface as your body, which meant waking up with a stiff neck was common. Blankets were heavy wool. Scratchy, smelly, and not washed often. In winter, you'd pile on as many as you could find, plus your cloak, plus maybe an animal hide if you had one. In summer, you'd sweat under the same wool blanket because that's all you had. And you didn't sleep alone. Privacy wasn't a thing. Your entire family shared the same sleeping space. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all in the same room. Often in the same bed. Infants slept with their mothers. Older children piled together. If you were lucky enough to have a second sleeping platform or loft, maybe the kids slept up there while the adults stayed below. Animals often slept inside too. Not because people wanted them there, but because keeping them indoors at night protected them from theft and predators. So you'd have a goat or pig or chickens sharing your living space, adding their own smells and sounds to the mix. Nightmares were taken very seriously. People believed dreams had meaning, that they were messages from God or omens of things to come. A bad dream could terrify someone for days. There were prayers specifically meant to ward off nightmares, and some people kept religious tokens under their pillows for protection. Sleepwalking was also feared. If someone walked in their sleep, it was sometimes thought to be demonic possession or a sign of witchcraft. People who sleepwalked were watched carefully and sometimes restrained at night to keep them from wandering. Snoring was as annoying then as it is now. But there was no such thing as a separate bedroom. If your husband snored, you just dealt with it. Maybe you elbowed him. Maybe you learned to sleep through it. Or maybe you just didn't sleep much. So when we talk about medieval sleep, we're not just talking about segmented patterns. We're talking about sleeping in conditions that were cold, uncomfortable, crowded, and full of bugs. Sleeping in a world where darkness was total, where silence was rare, and where rest was always interrupted by something. A crying baby, a coughing family member, an animal moving around, the cold, the heat, the fear. And yet, people adapted. They developed routines and customs. They created a sleep pattern that fit their world. And they did it for generations, never knowing that someday, people would sleep in soft beds with springs and memory foam, in rooms with climate control and blackout curtains, alone or with just one other person, for 8 uninterrupted hours. They would have thought that sounded like paradise. Now let's talk about something even grimmer than disease and poverty. Crime and punishment. If you thought medieval justice was fair or reasonable, you're in for a shock. The legal system was brutal, arbitrary, and often completely insane. Stealing was one of the most common crimes. And it makes sense. When people are starving, they steal food. When they're desperate, they steal anything they can sell. But medieval society had zero tolerance for theft. Even stealing something small could get you maimed or killed. For minor theft, you might be put in the stocks. These were wooden frames that locked your head and hands in place in the middle of the village square. You'd be stuck there for hours, sometimes days, while people walked by and mocked you. They'd throw rotten vegetables, dung, rocks. Kids would poke you with sticks. It was humiliating, painful, and sometimes dangerous if the crowd got violent. For more serious theft, you'd be branded. A hot iron pressed into your hand or forehead, burning a letter into your skin. Usually AT for thief. This mark was permanent. Everyone who saw it would know you were a criminal. You'd never be trusted again. Finding work would be almost impossible. You were marked for life. Repeat offenders had it worse. Lose a hand. Literally. Your hand would be cut off in public as a warning to others. This was called mutilation, and it was common. Can't work? Can't feed yourself? Too bad. You stole, you paid the price. And if you stole again after that, you'd be hanged. Murder was obviously a capital crime. But so were a lot of other things. Poaching deer from the king's forest. Death. Counterfeiting coins. Death. Arson. Death. Treason, which could mean anything from plotting against the king to just saying the wrong thing about him. Death. Executions were public events. The whole village would turn out to watch. Hangings were the most common method. The condemned would be led to a wooden gallows, a noose placed around their neck, and then they'd be pushed off a platform or a ladder. If they were lucky, their neck broke immediately and they died fast. If they weren't lucky, they'd strangle slowly, kicking and gasping for several minutes while the crowd watched. Beheading was considered a more honorable death, usually reserved for nobles. An executioner with an axe or sword would remove the head in one swift blow. In theory. In practice, it sometimes took multiple swings, which was as horrific as it sounds. Burning at the stake was used for heretics, witches, and sometimes traitors. The person would be tied to a wooden post, surrounded by kindling and logs, and set on fire. The smoke would often kill them before the flames did, but not always. It was a slow, agonizing death, and it was meant to be. The point was to make an example. Then there was drawing and quartering, one of the most brutal punishments ever devised. Reserved for the worst crimes, like high treason. The condemned would be dragged through the streets tied to a horse. Then they'd be hanged, but cut down before they died. Then disemboweled while still alive. Then beheaded. Then their body would be cut into 4 pieces and displayed in different parts of the city as a warning. It was barbaric. It was also legal. Trials were not what you'd call fair. There were no lawyers for common people. No presumption of innocence. If you were accused, you were probably guilty in everyone's eyes already. Evidence was often thin or non-existent. Witnesses could be bribed or intimidated. Confessions were extracted through torture. Yes, torture. If you were suspected of a serious crime and refused to confess, they'd torture you until you did. The rack would stretch your body until joints dislocated. Thumbscrews crushed your fingers. Red-hot pincers pulled at your flesh. Eventually, most people confessed, whether they were guilty or not, just to make it stop. Trial by ordeal was another method. The idea was that God would protect the innocent and punish the guilty. So they'd make you do something dangerous or painful, and if you survived, you were innocent. If you didn't, well, you were guilty and also dead. One ordeal involved holding a red-hot iron bar and walking several paces. Then your hand would be bandaged. 3 days later, they'd unwrap it. If it was healing cleanly, you were innocent. If it was infected, you were guilty. Given medieval hygiene, most burns got infected. Another ordeal was being thrown into water. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. Because pure water would reject a guilty person. This made no sense, but they believed it. Many innocent people drowned. There was also trial by combat. 2 people would fight, and whoever won was considered to be in the right because God favored them. This was used for disputes between nobles mostly, but occasionally commoners could hire a champion to fight for them. It was brutal and unfair, but it was considered justice. Prisons existed, but they weren't like modern prisons. They were mostly holding cells where you waited for trial or punishment. Long-term imprisonment was rare. If you were guilty, you were punished immediately. Fined, mutilated, or executed. Keeping criminals locked up for years wasn't practical or considered useful. Debtor's prison was different. If you owed money and couldn't pay, you'd be locked up until you or your family paid the debt. Which created a cruel irony. You couldn't earn money while imprisoned, so you couldn't pay your debt, so you stayed imprisoned. Some people died there. The wealthy, of course, had options. They could pay fines instead of facing physical punishment. They could hire lawyers or bribe officials. Justice was not blind. It was very aware of your social class. If you were a peasant accused of a crime, you were almost certainly doomed. If you were a noble, you might walk away with a fine and a stern warning. The system was designed to protect the powerful and crush the weak. And the church had its own courts. Ecclesiastical courts handled crimes like heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, and moral offenses. These courts were even less forgiving than secular ones. And because the church had enormous power, being tried in an ecclesiastical court often meant you had no chance. So crime in medieval times wasn't just about breaking the law. It was about survival. Desperate people did desperate things. And the system responded with brutal, public violence meant to terrify everyone else into obedience. Justice wasn't about rehabilitation or fairness. It was about control. And if you were accused, guilty or not, your life was probably over. Let's shift gears one more time. Away from daily life, away from crime, and into something that terrified entire populations. War. Specifically, siege warfare. Because when armies came to your town, things got very bad very fast. Medieval warfare wasn't like the movies. There weren't massive field battles every week. Most conflicts were decided by sieges. One army would surround a castle or walled city, cut it off from the outside world, and wait. Wait for the defenders to run out of food. Wait for disease to spread. Wait for desperation to set in. Sieges could last months, even years. If you lived in a town under siege, your life became a nightmare. Food supplies would be rationed almost immediately. That bread you were already struggling to afford. Now it's divided among even more people, and the price skyrockets. Merchants hoard what they have. The wealthy eat well. Everyone else starves slowly. Water could become a problem too. If the town's wells ran dry or got contaminated, you'd have to drink whatever was available. And in a crowded, besieged town, water sources got filthy fast. Disease would spread. Dysentery, typhus, cholera. People would die not from enemy weapons, but from their own waste. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the attacking army would set up camp. They'd build their own fortifications, dig trenches, and settle in for the long haul. And then they'd start working on ways to get inside. The simplest method was starvation. Just wait. Eventually, the people inside would get so desperate they'd surrender. Or they'd open the gates themselves and beg for mercy. This method required patience, but it worked. And it cost the attackers very little. But if you wanted faster results, you'd use siege engines. These were massive wooden machines designed to break walls or kill defenders. The most famous was the trebuchet. A giant catapult that used a counterweight to fling heavy stones hundreds of feet. These stones would crash into walls, towers, gates. Over and over. Day and night. The constant bombardment would wear down the fortifications and the morale of everyone inside. Then there was the battering ram. A huge log, often tipped with metal, suspended from a wooden frame. Soldiers would push it back and forth, slamming it into gates or weak points in the wall. It was exhausting, dangerous work. Defenders on the walls above would drop rocks, pour boiling water or oil, shoot arrows. Many soldiers operating the ram would die. But if the ram broke through, the city was done. Siege towers were mobile wooden structures as tall as the walls themselves. Soldiers would push them up to the wall, drop a drawbridge from the top, and storm across. These towers were covered in wet hides to protect against fire. But they were still vulnerable. Defenders would do everything they could to burn them or topple them before they reached the wall. Undermining was another tactic. Attackers would dig tunnels under the walls, shoring them up with wooden beams. Then they'd set the beams on fire and collapse the tunnel, bringing the wall down with it. This was slow, dangerous work. Tunnels could collapse prematurely, burying the diggers alive. Defenders would dig counter-tunnels and try to intercept the attackers underground. Sometimes there would be brutal fights in the dark, cramped tunnels. And then there was fire. Attackers would launch flaming projectiles over the walls, trying to set buildings on fire. In a medieval town with wooden structures packed close together, one fire could spread fast. Defenders would rush to put it out, but water was often scarce during a siege. Buildings would burn, people would die, and the smoke would choke everyone. Psychological warfare was huge. Attackers would display their siege engines prominently, making them look as terrifying as possible. They'd parade captured prisoners in front of the walls, sometimes torturing or executing them where defenders could see. The message was clear: surrender or this will be you. Defenders weren't helpless, though. They'd repair walls at night. They'd launch their own projectiles at the siege camp. They'd pour boiling oil or pitch on soldiers trying to scale the walls. They'd shoot arrows and crossbow bolts at anyone who got too close. Some defenders would launch surprise raids, sneaking out at night to set siege engines on fire or kill enemy soldiers. But time was always on the attackers' side. As food ran out, as disease spread, as hope faded, the people inside would start to crack. There would be arguments, panic, desperation. Some would want to surrender. Others would want to fight to the death. And sometimes, someone on the inside would betray the city. Open a gate. Let the enemy in. Either for a reward or because they believed it was the only way to survive. When a city finally fell, what happened next depended on the attackers. If the city surrendered before the walls were breached, the terms might be relatively merciful. The lord would be taken prisoner, a ransom demanded, but most people would be spared. But if the attackers had to break through by force, all bets were off. Medieval armies operated on the principle that a city taken by storm could be sacked, looted, burned. The soldiers who had spent months besieging the place, who had lost friends to arrows and disease, wanted revenge. And they took it. Houses would be ransacked. Anything valuable would be stolen. People who resisted would be killed. Women would be assaulted. The city would burn. For days, sometimes weeks, chaos would reign. By the time it was over, the city might be a smoking ruin. This wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was strategy. When word spread that a particular army had sacked a city, other towns would be more likely to surrender without a fight. Terror was a weapon as effective as any trebuchet. And for the people living through a siege, there was no good outcome. Either you starved inside the walls, died from disease, got killed when the walls fell, or survived only to see your city destroyed. Siege warfare was about breaking not just walls, but spirits. And it worked. So when we talk about medieval warfare, we're not talking about glorious battles and heroic knights. We're talking about months of slow starvation, disease, fear, and finally, if you were unlucky, brutal violence. That was the reality. And it happened over and over, all across Europe, for centuries. And the worst part? Most of the people who suffered were just peasants. Farmers, craftsmen, families who had no say in the conflict. They just happened to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they paid the price. Before we close out this journey through medieval life, there's one more aspect we need to talk about. Superstition. Because medieval people believed in things that would sound absolutely insane to us today. And these beliefs shaped every part of their lives. Let's start with the obvious one. Witchcraft. People genuinely believed that some individuals, usually women, had made pacts with the devil and gained supernatural powers. These witches could supposedly curse your crops, make your cow stop producing milk, cause your child to fall ill, or hex you in countless other ways. If something went wrong and you couldn't explain it, witchcraft was a convenient answer. Your bread didn't rise. A witch cursed your oven. Your wife had a miscarriage. A witch cast a spell. Your neighbor's harvest was better than yours. Clearly, they're using dark magic. It sounds ridiculous now, but back then, people were executed over these accusations. Witch trials were terrifying. If someone accused you of witchcraft, you were basically doomed. The evidence required was minimal. Maybe you were seen talking to yourself. Maybe you owned a black cat. Maybe you were just old and lived alone. That was enough to get you dragged in front of a court. And remember those trials we talked about earlier? They applied here too. If you floated in water, you were a witch and would be burned. If you sank and drowned, congratulations, you were innocent. Either way, you were dead. Thousands of people, mostly women, were killed on accusations of witchcraft throughout the medieval period and into the early modern era. Then there were omens. Everything was a sign of something. A black cat crossing your path. Bad luck. A raven landing on your roof. Death was coming. Spilling salt. You'd have misfortune unless you threw some over your left shoulder to blind the devil. Breaking a mirror. 7 years of bad luck. Dreams were taken incredibly seriously. If you dreamed of certain things, it meant something specific. Dream of teeth falling out. Someone close to you would die. Dream of water. Trouble was coming. People would consult dream interpreters, who were considered wise and knowledgeable. Eclipses terrified people. When the sun or moon was suddenly blocked, it seemed like the end of the world. People would pray, panic, make offerings to God. They didn't understand the astronomy behind it. They just knew that something was very wrong, and it must be a divine warning or punishment. Comets were seen as omens of disaster. War, famine, plague, the death of a king. Something terrible always followed a comet. When one appeared in the sky, people would brace themselves for catastrophe. And because terrible things happened fairly regularly in medieval times, there was always something to point to as proof. Illness was often blamed on supernatural causes. If you got sick, maybe you'd angered God. Maybe a witch cursed you. Maybe you'd been possessed by a demon. Medical treatments were mixed with prayers, charms, and rituals. You'd take herbal medicine while also wearing an amulet and praying to a saint. Amulets and charms were everywhere. People wore them for protection against evil, illness, bad luck. A rabbit's foot for good fortune. A piece of iron to ward off fairies. A cross to keep demons away. A saint's medal for divine protection. These weren't just accessories. They were believed to have real power. Speaking of fairies, people believed in them too. Not the cute, tiny, friendly fairies from modern children's stories. Medieval fairies were dangerous, unpredictable beings that lived in the woods and hills. They could steal children, replace them with changelings. They could curse you or bless you depending on their mood. You had to be careful around certain places, like fairy rings of mushrooms, because stepping inside could trap you in their world. Ghosts were real. If someone died violently or with unfinished business, their spirit might linger. Haunted houses, restless spirits, vengeful ghosts. These weren't just stories. People believed they saw and heard them. And when strange things happened, creaky floors, unexplained sounds, cold spots, ghosts were the explanation. The number 13 was unlucky. Friday the 13th was especially bad. 13 people at a table. Someone would die within the year. This superstition was so strong that people would avoid the number whenever possible. Garlic was believed to ward off evil. Not just vampires, that came later, but evil in general. Demons, witches, bad spirits. Hanging garlic in your home was a form of protection. It was also used in medicine, so it had a dual purpose. Knocking on wood to avoid bad luck. Throwing coins into wells for wishes. Never walking under a ladder. Not opening an umbrella indoors. Many of these superstitions that we still half-jokingly follow today have their roots in medieval beliefs. The phases of the moon affected everything. Plant your crops during a waxing moon, they'd grow better. Cut your hair during a waning moon, it would grow back thicker. Get married during a full moon for good fortune. The moon's influence was considered powerful and real. And then there were saints. Not just as religious figures, but as intercessors with specific powers. Pray to Saint Anthony to find lost objects. Pray to Saint Jude for hopeless causes. Pray to Saint Christopher for safe travel. Each saint had a specialty, and people would appeal to the right one for their needs. Curses were real too. If someone wished harm on you, especially if they had some authority or power, you'd worry about it. A priest's curse was particularly feared because it carried divine weight. Even a beggar's curse could haunt you if you'd wronged them. Bleeding and purging were done according to astrological signs. The position of stars and planets was thought to affect the body's humors. So a doctor, if you had access to one, would consult the stars before treating you. The point is, medieval people lived in a world full of invisible forces. Magic, spirits, omens, curses, blessings. The supernatural wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into everything. And while we might look back and think they were ignorant or foolish, they were just trying to make sense of a world they didn't understand. A world where disease struck randomly, where crops failed without warning, where people died young for no clear reason. When you don't have science to explain things, you create other explanations. And those explanations become belief. And belief becomes truth. So when a medieval peasant saw a black cat at night and felt genuine fear, it wasn't stupidity. It was the weight of everything they'd been taught, everything their culture believed, everything that helped them cope with a brutal, unpredictable world. And in that context, superstition made perfect sense. So here we are. We've spent hours walking through medieval life. We've woken up in a flea-infested hut. We've eaten terrible food. We've worked until our bodies broke. We've frozen in winter, suffered through disease, feared the church, endured brutal justice, survived sieges, and lived among superstitions that shaped every moment, and through all of it, one thing becomes clear. You wouldn't have lasted a day. Not because you're weak. But because medieval life was designed to break people. It was relentless, unforgiving, and cruel in ways we can barely imagine today. Every single thing we take for granted, clean water, safe food, basic medicine, comfortable shelter, was either non-existent or a luxury beyond reach for most people. The gap between our lives and theirs is so vast it's almost incomprehensible. Think about your morning. You woke up in a bed with a mattress, pillows, clean sheets. You walked to a bathroom with running water, soap, a toilet that flushes. You ate breakfast that didn't contain rocks or mold. You got dressed in clothes that were washed in a machine with detergent. You probably checked your phone, turned on a light with a switch, adjusted the temperature in your home with a thermostat. Every single one of those things would have seemed like magic to a medieval peasant. Not just luxury. Magic. The idea that water comes out of a wall when you turn a handle. That you can make a room warmer or cooler at will. That you can see in the dark by flipping a switch. That you can talk to someone on the other side of the world instantly. It would have been beyond their wildest dreams, but it's not just the physical comforts. It's the freedom. You can choose your job, your partner, where you live. You're not tied to the land you were born on. You're not forced to obey a lord or pay tithes to a church. You have rights, protections, options. You can leave. You can change your life. Medieval peasants couldn't do any of that, and the safety. You're not worried about starving this winter. You're not terrified of disease because you know doctors exist and medicine works. You're not afraid of being accused of witchcraft or executed for stealing bread. You don't live in constant fear of war, siege, or violence. Your world is stable in ways there's never was. The average lifespan today is around 70 to 80 years. In medieval times, if you made it to 40, you were doing well. Infant mortality was so high that parents expected to lose children. Women died in childbirth regularly. A simple infection could kill you. Life was short, painful, and hard, but here's the thing. Those people, those medieval peasants we've been talking about, they didn't know any different. This was just life. They didn't sit around thinking about how much better things could be because they had no frame of reference. They were born into this world, they lived in it, and they died in it, never knowing that centuries later, humans would live in heated homes and fly through the sky and carry all of human knowledge in their pockets. They endured because they had no choice. And in their endurance, they built the foundation for everything that came after. Every generation suffered a little less than the one before, learned a little more, improved things incrementally. Over centuries, those tiny improvements added up. And eventually, they became the world we live in now. So when you go to bed tonight in your comfortable room, with your soft blankets and your climate control and your safety, take a moment to appreciate it. Not in an abstract way, but really think about it. Think about the fact that you'll sleep through the night uninterrupted. That you won't wake up freezing or covered in bug bites. That you won't be hungry. That you're not afraid of disease or war or starvation. Think about the millions of people across human history who would have given anything, for just one night of the comfort you experience every single day without even noticing, and maybe feel grateful. Not guilty. Grateful. Because you didn't do anything wrong by being born. In the 21st century. You're just incredibly, impossibly lucky. You won the lottery of human history. You exist in a time and place where life is easier, longer, safer, and more comfortable than at any other point in the past. Medieval life was brutal. But it's over. Those people are gone. Their suffering is done. And we're here, living in the world they helped build, even if they never knew it would exist. So sleep well tonight. Sleep peacefully. Sleep in comfort. And as you drift off, remember that for most of human history, sleep was just another form of survival. But for you, it's rest. Real rest. The kind that medieval peasants could only dream of. This has been a journey through the hardest, darkest, most difficult period of European history. A time when simply being alive was an accomplishment. And you've made it through. Not literally, of course. But you've walked alongside them for a while. You've seen what they saw, felt what they felt, understood what they endured. And now it's time to let them rest. And for you to rest too. Close your eyes. Let the warmth surround you. Let the comfort hold you. And drift away, knowing that you're safe. Knowing that tomorrow, you'll wake up in a world they couldn't have imagined. A world where you'll survive not just one day, but many. A world where you're free. Good night. And thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Sleep well.